Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Gail Day. I am the Executive Manager at the Free Market Foundation. Today we are launching the second in a series of 8 booklets titled Laws Affecting Small Business. The series was first published by the FMF in the late 1990s. As red tape continues to undermine business, we've updated the series, which deals with finance, health, justice, labor, land, licensing, schooling, and tax. Terence Corrigan, who is project manager at the Institute of Race Relations, will be presenting the land booklet. Thank you very much, Terence.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Let me just start off by saying that I was involved in preparing the booklet, so I'm speaking to the document and the themes that it covers. It's always a pleasure to attend Free Market Foundation events. The Institute and the Free Market Foundation have a long and cordial association with each other. Differences of emphasis rather than fundamental direction, I'd say. Right. Now I'm going to scroll through a few slides to raise some points, which I hope will introduce the document and some food for thought for further conversation. After which I'd be very happy to take any comments, critiques, slings and arrows, kisses or hugs that any of the audience might wish to direct at me. Now, this is all, of course, contingent on whether I can work out how to share the document. Bear with me for a second. There we go. Right, can I just ask if everyone can see that?
I can see it. Thank you, Terence.
Okay, great. Okay. Right, small business. I've titled my presentation "The Under-Discussed Land Question." Now, I had a period of my career where I focused very much on small business, and that's not entirely surprising, since small business has been one of those recurrent themes that actually bridges pre-1994 South Africa with post-1994 South Africa. Those of you who remember the Rubicon speech, former President Botha, there's a wonderful line there about how I'm of the opinion that there are far too many restrictions and burdens on small business. And now we can go through that through the RDP, we can go through GEAR, we can go through every other growth strategy that South Africa has come up with since 1994, and one right the way through to President Ramaphosa earlier this year, talking about the wonderful contribution that small business makes to the country, and how we really needed to do so much more. And for those of you who still remember the National Development Plan, I like this quote: "South Africa needs faster growth and more inclusive growth. The key elements of the strategy include raising exports and improving skills development, lowering the cost of living for the poor, investing in a competitive infrastructure, reducing the regulatory burden on small business." I think that's the key one here. Facilitating private investment, which is very much linked to the previous one, and improving the performance of the labor market to reduce tension and ease access to young and unskilled work seekers. Now, small businesses are universally recognized as being a part of the economy that is primed for growth. It's primed for small scale, particularly, not just entry level entrepreneurship, but one has to start somewhere. One starts small. If one's business is successful, then expansion, of course, is always a positive. Something that we also sometimes lose sight of. But it's also recognized internationally that small businesses are less able to deal with the imposed costs of regulation than their larger counterparts, and it's simply a question of scale. If you need to process a form and you're a one-man band, well, that's your time. If you have a staff of 3,000 people, you can probably afford to have one person who does that as the as his or her sole responsibility. And I think this is really what this what this project and this booklet gets at. How does this play out with respect to land? Now, land, for those of you who are familiar with me or my work, would know that that's an issue that I have devoted the last couple of years of my life to, particularly the question around property rights and expropriation without compensation. For clarity, I'm in favor of property rights and opposed to expropriation without compensation. Just important that that we say these things. Land and small business. I think a good way to see this is to look at the role it plays as, in a sense, bifurcated. Land, as anyone with an understanding of economics would know, is a factor of production. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Land is the one of those four. In order to put up a factory or a business premises, you need some sort of space. Historically, that was technically, an actual piece of land, although as time has moved on, it's become a more virtual and sometimes abstract concept. But I think that it's important to see this along with land as a factor in production. What do I mean here? Land is it's not simply about having a piece of sod to build your structure on. It's not simply about having a few hectares to farm, or a premises on a city block to open up your grocery store. Land is an asset. It's something that people can own. It is something that makes that can be leveraged. It's something that can be used. And when I say a factor in production, what I mean here is that it is something that you can take to a financial institution. You can use for capital. This is essentially the Hernando de Soto argument, and I'm well aware that there've been certain trenchant criticisms raised of his argument, and I think that there is some merit to some of those. But nevertheless, for many people in South Africa and across the continent, they have access to land, but not access to property. This is why I think that so much of our policy discussion needs to shift from dealing with the land question to dealing with the question of property rights. What enables you to turn a piece of land into an asset that can be leveraged or that can be used in some other way? Now, what's in this report? This report at about 33 pages, nice and succinctly written, and it looks at I think there's 9 or 10 distinct themes: property rights and land. Do people own? Can they own? What can they then do with that ownership? I've often said in my writing that we have an interesting situation in South Africa where, despite a great deal of very tangible desire on the part of South Africans to own things, to own their homes, and despite what has not been an entirely unsuccessful program to roll out housing, the focus has been invariably on providing shelter, on providing access to housing, I think, as the constitutional formulation has it, but not to actually provide property. And I think that for various ideological reasons, this is something that the authorities have been very cagey of engaging with. You may have access to it. You may be able to get hold of a piece. You may be able to use it to some extent, but property and ownership are something that officialdom and official thinking is often very skeptical of. Superfluous government land. There is, of course, a very large quantity of land in the hands of the state. Some years ago, a figure was put forward of 4,000 farms that have been acquired through the various land acquisition programs for redistribution, but have not actually been transferred. There's also land in the holdings of parastatals, government departments, and things like that. Can this perhaps be made available? Administration disposal of tribal land. My understanding is the largest single block of property in South Africa is the Ingonyama Trust, which is most of the erstwhile KwaZulu homeland. That is, I also understand, something of a nightmare to operate on. It's management is quite remote and not always particularly efficient for entrepreneurs wishing to establish businesses. It's difficult to know, where your rights start, where the rights or entitlements of local communities start. Whom do you approach? Um, how do you get around all that? And that is, I think, seems to me one of the great unresolved post-apartheid issues. That if the apartheid government said that black people had their own distinct system of property holding, which would be vested in the hands of traditional authorities of the state, the post-apartheid government seems to have said, well, it's actually not a bad idea, and we carry on. The challenge of secure title. Many people, have structures, they have houses, they have shelter, they have a sort of customary entitlement to something, but no means of legally proving that sort of ownership. The challenge of financing. How do you use your land that you may have access to raise capital? And the subdivision of agricultural land. Now, this, of course, is a complex and quite technical matter, but the basic thinking around it was that farms needed to be maintained at commercially viable sizes, which made it difficult to dispose of sections of them to cut smaller scale producers in, and to confer ownership. That's my understanding, even though there's been talk about making changes to this still remains the case. Removal of restrictions on land use, zoning. If you speak to any city council in a large city, you can. This is one of the most aggressive headaches. One is not entitled to simply do anything anywhere, and that comes with certain costs. The Housing Consumers Protection Measures Act. State intervention may be well intended, but its outcomes may not in all cases be optimally efficient, or may work to the protection of interests other than those to whom the relevant legislation claims to be directed. The removal of transfer duties when paying to sell a property from one owner to another, and then, of course, expropriation. And I think one can probably write in something like expropriation without compensation. And I would go back to the first of these in this list: the question of property rights and the discretion that the state assumes over one's property. And I think that makes the question of expropriation without compensation, and recent legislation such as the Land Courts Bill and the Expropriation Act, particularly significant. Once again, I think it was Milton Friedman, and I imagine a name well known to many people in this audience, who said something about how we should not go along with policy simply because it claims to have noble intentions, but we must look at the actual outcomes. So, what are the themes? Okay, if I take those 9 or 10 sections, I'll boil them down into 3 things. Property ownership. Okay, do we get to own our stuff? Do we get to own land? And as I say, I think there's been a profound ambiguity on the part of the and ambivalence on the part of the state on this issue. And I think that if there's one thing that I find very confusing about the debate around landed property, it's this question. So much of it is presented as in restoring or redistributing land, but there's very little that I can see that suggests that the state really wants to transfer its ownership. What it's talking about is the state wants an expanded discretion, and then to distribute and confer rights while retaining the ultimate ownership, or if you prefer the phrase, custodianship. The second is property holding. I'll distinguish this slightly from the question of ownership. Holding is how one retains it. It's how one goes about with it day to day. And I think that for millions of South Africans, this is a crucially important and eminently frustrating distinction. Traditional communities, for instance, often find that despite long-term settlement on a piece of land, they simply have no real legal claim. Things are pushed back onto the jurisdiction of traditional leaders, onto customary law. I remember one German expert on property who'd done some research on the matter here, described it to me as it's very non-transparent, which I found interesting. And the third is the question of property rights. What is the right of the individual, of the household, and indeed of the small business owner in holding, owning, and disposing of one's property, and in using? Well, this can be one can think about this, for instance, in terms of the continuity from the past, that land ownership remains restricted, land holding often precarious. Acquiring and using land is unnecessarily onerous, and this imposes an outsized burden on small nascent firms and entrepreneurs. Let me give you an example. For instance, if you think about an aspirant commercial farmer, someone who has maybe farmed on some sort of subsistence level, but you would like to upgrade your operations in a traditional area. Well, you do not have title to that land, and therefore no means of using it for the purposes of accessing credit. If you are an aspirant township entrepreneur, perhaps your family has occupied the same house for 50 years, but that house technically may not belong to you. If you have an idea for a particular business in an area zoned for a particular purpose, well, that's a long involved, and I think a long involved process to try and change. And I think this is really what this report is getting at.
Terence, if I might just interrupt
Yes.
you for a moment.
Yes.
Jim, if you don't mind just turning off your camera, please, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that this is really what this report is getting at. Now, I'm not going to go through the numerous recommendations. Those I've read, and for the most part, I think that they are very sensible. One might quibble about certain details, but I think that each of you will find in this document something of value, and I'm very happy to do some back and forth about my own feelings. The point is, though, a nascent entrepreneur to the extent that he or she deals with the land question, faces, I think, three sets of distinct challenges: the lack of tenure security, the denial of that's particularly, as I say, a question where the state or some sort of state agent acts as the landlord, denial of collateral, um, the inability to leverage property that you may hold, as I say, the distinction between ownership and holding, and the permanent vulnerability. And I think this is particularly the case where the state is weak and unable, and I think in many respects, disinterested in enforcing in performing what I think should be a prime economic task, which is ensuring the rule of law and durability of contracts. So what do we do? Well, the basic thrust of the report I can put in three blocks here. First of all, reform and liberalize property ownership systems. It's interesting how there is such an emphasis in our political debate on making things like voting as accessible and easy as possible, but not on owning things. We jealously we jealously guard our political rights, but we seem to think that our economic rights should be subject to various constraints and restraints. Make it easy for people to own things. And I'd say this applies equally to access to property itself. And this is why I, for instance, am in favor of approving exercised land reform process, but also to hold rights in property, not simply, to own a house as opposed to merely having shelter. Grant title and user rights where these exist informally or where people have been prevented from acquiring them. There's as I've said earlier, this is fundamentally germane to the question of traditional rights, or to communities in townships who have occupied the same piece of land, the same building for perhaps for generations, but are unable to get title and therefore the legal recognition of it. And then recognize the limitations of the country's administration. This, I think, is very, very important. I think it's something that often falls through the cracks. South Africa's state is, well, to put it mildly, not what it should be. We are not dealing with with German or Swedish or Singaporean levels of efficiency. And if you ask me, something that always sticks out like the proverbial sore thumb in pretty much anything that the government proposes, it's that it views the state as playing a guiding, a leading, a developmental role. And I don't myself necessarily dispute the fact that a well-organized and well-capacitated state can play such a role, but this is not the reality in South Africa. Making things simpler, but simpler, and removing unnecessary and counterproductive steps on this journey, I think is good for everyone, including, I would say, for the state itself. So the basic message: expand, do not truncate property rights and pathways to property. This is something that I think is very, very deeply rooted in South Africans' culture. In fact, I remember back in 1997 when I started my career, speaking to a gentleman who was a civil servant in the Pretoria municipality, and he was the generation of 1976, and we were talking about Black consciousness and whatever, and I mentioned the question of African culture and socialism, and he chuckled and he said, what people don't, what the ideologues amongst us don't understand is that African culture actually has a very deep veneration for property. If you don't believe that, ask about the collection of cows. Those were things that we as individuals and as communities have always owned. Sometimes held individually, sometimes held held in common. Yet that is something within within our culture, within our frame of reference and our frame of aspiration. So with that, let me conclude. Many thanks. That's my email if anyone would like to pick up the conversation, and I'd be very happy then to accept any queries and yeah, to have a back and forth.
Thank you very much, Terence. Are there any questions for Terence? Can you see the chat, Terence? Are you able to manage that?
Yeah.
Right. Just give people a moment. Hopefully they're typing. Or if you guys want to ask verbally, just unmute yourselves. Very happy for that.
Terry,
yeah, somebody,
yes.
yeah.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Hi, Terence.
Yes.
This is not really a question, but more a request to anybody who's present to say, you spoke about tribal land and so on, and really it would be fantastic if we could do a pilot study on it on tribal land. So what we're looking for is what I would call a progressive chief, who would go along with converting his tribal area into private property. I did come across something and this is something just that I don't do a lot of, but I did come across somebody in Inyama Trust, but an area of that where the local chief literally on a carbon copy book says, okay, you have the right to this property for 10 years or whatever it is. I've no idea how valid that is or anything like that. The guy who I spoke to thought it was pretty valid, and it was described and so on. But it was hardly a right that would go to the top courts to be protected. But it's at least maybe it's a start. And I just realized if anybody knows of anybody of a chief, a progressive chief, a friendly chief who would like to do this, that would be good news. Thanks.
Well, actually, let me speak directly to that. One of the concerns, and I think it is a concern with some merit, that moving from traditional to freehold property, or whatever variant of that, is that it often brings people who do not have experience of dealing with a legal system into one, and they often find themselves ill-equipped to handle it. Now, I think that it's possible to overstate the danger there, and I think that is rolled out regularly by people who simply have a visceral dislike of private property. But I do think we should take cognizance of it. However, what you're describing has actually, there are experiments in this across Africa, in Madagascar, in Botswana, in Ethiopia, in Zambia. Essentially, it means kind of getting some sort of formal third-party recognition of your informal rights. Sometimes this is done by getting a letter from your chief, or your local government official who's in charge of it, taking it to the police officer or the commissioner of oaths and having it stamped. Now, will it stand up in court? I think it very much depends what the actual circumstance is. But as you say, it is a start, and I certainly think that we need experimentation with systems like that.
Yes, and I came across an example in Uganda where they're using blockchain and chain, but I mean you've got to have some authority at the top to say yes, let's go ahead and do it. You can't just go and do it without the authority. So
yeah. Look, that's the whole question of any kind of institutional power. it needs to be a reciprocal relationship if it's going to be legitimate. In Ethiopia, I think actually this has been done as an initiative of the government, sort of overriding traditional authorities. But yeah, in Zambia, I think it's been done in particular areas with I think they call them customary tenure certificates. If I remember correctly, it's done as a partnership between NGOs, churches, traditional leaders, and then individual landholders. One area where apparently it does make a large difference is if women can get their names onto these documents, because that provides them that does provide a very, very strong kind of moral shield about being dispossessed when your husband dies, which is apparent, which I know from experience is an extremely live issue across the continent.
Thanks.
Terence?
Yes.
We have across South Africa, we have these, what they call townships, next to every city or town. And have you come across any manner in which those areas can be allowed to develop away from being just housing? I think what we've discussed in the past in the Free Market Foundation is to declare some of them to be development areas where you can turn your house into a shop or whatever. So in order to allow those areas to change and become, let's call it, normal, as in the rest of the town or city that they are adjacent to.
Well, the report actually has recommendations to that effect. I think that the reality in much of the country is that there simply exists very little capacity to enforce those regulations. And one doesn't have to go into into what we established as townships. Problem that we have in main, sort of established whatever phrase you want to use, Johannesburg with so-called rogue developers, because it often just takes so long to get the necessary permissions. In fact, I understand, some really significant landmarks, big shopping centers, have been constructed illegally. I think that I think this gets into a very important debate that needs to be had about to what extent should we look at deregulation simply because the capacity to actually the state lacks the ability to enforce its own writ. Of course, that would come with a great deal of pushback, not least from many sort of established businesses. There's big money in things like conveyancing and planning consulting. But yeah, look, I think that the sort of enterprise zone idea is a good one, but I do think it will need to come with other interventions that make those township areas competitive in their own right. Work that I did on small business some years ago. Something that shines very, very powerfully is, for instance, the impact that that crime and security concerns have. You know, guys who were trying to set up firms, particularly in those underserviced communities, you know, would find their building sites stripped clean overnight. I don't have any fast and easy solutions to that.
What you could do possibly is to let the people of the area decide by vote.
Yeah.
You know, a proposition gets put forward for a change to take place, and they can then vote against it or vote for it. If they vote for it, then it should work.
Okay. Yeah. No. Look, I think that I mean, I also spent a great deal of my life traveling around this great continent of ours, talking about civil society activism, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about there. If I may, Zakhele Mthembu, is there a recommendation you would consider the most important in the booklet? If given a chance to argue for one, which one would it be? Oh, okay, that is, as my late mother would say, a biggie. Look, I think that abandoning the plans for expropriation without compensation would, of course, be foremost on my mind, but that probably has a great deal to do with the fact that that's what I've spent the period since 2018 opposing. I would say that within the context of townships, converting apartheid title to full ownership, that's probably the one that I think, aside from the EWC question, I think that's something that for which there would be a great deal of enthusiasm, a great deal of support. You know, and I do, as I say, I do take the point about predatory interests, trying to deprive people who've newly acquired their property. But I think frankly, the holders of many of these properties have had to exist in a sort of murky legal twilight world for generations. I think they're quite capable of defending their interests. So that's the one I would probably go for.
Terence, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and the thought that you've put into this event. And if anybody would like to ask Terence additional questions, you have my email address and you have his. So please feel free to contact us. And thank you everybody for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I'll see there's Brian Skellen is typing.
Okay, we can wait.
Okay. Well, as I said, Terence at irr.org.za. Very, very happy to interact further.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.